Okay, just takes a second.
We all have on glasses.
I think Scott and I have the same glasses too.
Is that right?
I think so.
I'd like to welcome everyone this afternoon to the 25th of the COVID Calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. These calls are held every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Scott Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and I serve as the host for these discussions. We are streaming on YouTube Live. The link to this discussion can be found at the Scott Knowles YouTube channel, or you can email me directly or find me on Twitter at US of Disaster. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for guests and future topics. And please do feel free to suggest yourself for one of the future COVID calls. You can also hear the COVID calls recorded as podcasts. Just go to soundcloud.com and search for the Slow Disaster Podcast. How do you expect COVID-19 to change American governance? I hope you will join me on Monday for a discussion of COVID-19 and government with Tom Birkeland, Rob DeLeo, and Kristen Taylor. It's going to be a great conversation with them. As of today, there are 2,214,861 cases of COVID-19 confirmed globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 2,127,873 cases yesterday. 683,786 of those cases are in the United States, up from 653,825 yesterday. There are now a total of 34,575 deaths reported in the United States, up from 30,998 yesterday. 5,906 of those cases are in New Orleans, with 317 deaths reported by Johns Hopkins University. Today marks the 25th of the COVID calls. It is a milestone of sorts, and we have already built an archive. Some of you have been listening, participating from the beginning. I know some are just tuning in today for the first time because of our wonderful guests that we have today. But please do explore the archive and share it and use it. It's a resource for everyone in the research community. And I want to make a special plea now. If you are thinking of using COVID calls as an educational resource, please do reach out to me directly. I'd like for this venue to support pedagogical goals. And with the help of my colleague, Bucky Stanton, we are starting now to develop a curriculum based on the COVID calls with readings and questions and other materials to support the things that are being learned in these calls. We are literally discovering and exploring and sharing knowledge and sharing solidarity in this disaster in real time. So I'm seeking your input on that. Please feel free to get in touch with me by email or Twitter, however you can reach me to discuss pedagogy in these times, and let us use the COVID calls as a resource for you. So let me introduce my guests today. I have three wonderful guests. Karen Gadbois is the first I'd like to introduce. She co-founded The Lens. She now covers New Orleans government issues and writes about land use. With television reporter Lee Zurik, she exposed widespread misuse of city recovery funds and led to guilty pleas in federal court. Her work attracted some of journalism's highest honors, including a Peabody Award, an Alfred I. duPont-Columbia Award, and a gold medal from Investigative Reporters and Editors. And back in 2019, which may as well have been 10 years ago, Karen was kind enough to appear on a discussion at the annual 4S meeting in New Orleans, where she spoke to a room full of sociologists of science and historians and anthropologists about what it was like to write about disasters in New Orleans. And it's remarkable to have her back here today, and we might have a chance to talk about some of the issues that came up in that conversation. Andy Horowitz is assistant professor of history at Tulane University. His very much anticipated book, Katrina, A History, 1915 to 2015, is due out this summer with Harvard University Press. He also has another project underway on the emerging field of disaster studies, in which he is a crucial player. His writing has appeared in the Journal of Southern History, Southern Cultures, Historical Reflections, the Journal of American History, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and op-eds, multiple, in the New York Times. My third guest, Dr. Beverly Wright, is an environmental justice scholar and advocate, an author, a civic leader and professor of sociology, and the founder and executive director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. The center addresses environmental and health inequities along the Louisiana-Mississippi River chemical corridor of the Gulf Coast region. She is the author of numerous scholarly books and articles, some of which I have taught in my courses. She co-authored Race, Place, and the Environment after Hurricane Katrina, that came out with Westview Press, and The Wrong Complexion for Protection, How the Government Response Endangers African-American Communities, from NYU Press. I'd like to thank my three guests and say hello and welcome you to COVID Calls today.
Great to be here.
You.
I want to remind people that you can get your questions in for this discussion. Please use the YouTube live chat function, or you can tweet them to me and just tag @US of Disaster. This is the fastest way to get a question in, and we'll work through your questions as we go. I know many people are tuning in here today to hear from our guests. So let's jump right into things. I'd like to start the way I have been starting. It's a question to all of you. Karen, I'm going to ask you first. How are you doing? And can you tell us a little bit about your own situation there in New Orleans, what it's been like for you these past weeks?
Well, we're doing fine. And all the staff at the Lens is doing fine as well. Personally, I'm at home with my partner and a friend of ours who came to visit from Mexico City and was unable to go back home. So he's here with us too. We're staying out. We're staying in and not going out, except for food, and happily monitoring the situation from afar, from inside the house.
Beverly, what about you? Same question. How are things?
Well, things are busy as ever. It, in some ways, reminds me of how busy we became after Katrina. The difference being that we're locked inside our own homes, and at that time we were locked outside of the city. So there was still lockouts, in both situations. Because we do hazardous waste worker training as part of one of the biggest grants that we have, and we've been doing it for 25 years. Under the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, we find ourselves really busy because it is the agency that develops occupational health and safety standards for workers, and also is dealing directly now with coming up with curricula for communities to learn how not to transmit the virus. So you can imagine what it's like. It's webinars and podcasts, all day long instructional things. So we are very busy. People are very supportive of our work. So right now we're good, and we're all working from home.
Andy, same question to you. How did things wind down with Tulane? How are you at home?
Tulane closed around a little over a month ago, and they sort of gave us a week break to get students home. We had a week off to get resettled, and now everyone's been home for a little over a month. Like everyone else, it's surreal. I have colleagues who have gotten sick and gotten better. I have colleagues who are still, some quite ill right now, students who are sick. And much of this is, I say surreal because I know this all virtually. I haven't really left my front yard, haven't gone too much farther than that if I can help it. I live in Algiers, right across the Mississippi River from the French Quarter. And it seemed particularly pleasant, except for, maybe a little quieter, a few more ambulances than usual. Don't see too many people wearing masks when they're walking around. So it just seems like sort of an early Sunday morning feeling all the time if you were just looking. But the knowledge of what's going on around us is deeply horrifying.
Well, thank you all for sharing just those snippets of your own situation. I want to come to you, Beverly, first and ask a question. You're the founder of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and yesterday we had a conversation about Cancer Alley with Ashley Rogers and Joy Banner from the Whitney Plantation, and Sophie Kessiko, who's a journalist who wrote a piece for Vice about the situation there in Reserve, Louisiana. I wanted to ask you first about the environmental justice implications of COVID-19. One of the things I've been worried about is that the pandemic is going to shove everything else out of the way. It makes activism harder. It has seemingly enabled EPA to relax air quality standards. What are your thoughts on this in terms of thinking about two disasters simultaneously, the pandemic and the environmental assault that's every day in Southern Louisiana?
Well, for me, the two are connected in ways, that are extremely disturbing. We have been now for almost 30 years fighting for justice in the corridor and really all over the world where we have helped to develop environmental justice organizations. But the cry has always been that certain communities are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollutants. In an early study that I did, it was the first study to ever be done using spatial distance analysis. GIS is really popular now, but it wasn't then. And it basically showing that in Louisiana, African Americans live closest to these facilities than anyone else. We were complaining at that time about, health disparities, asthma rates. They even had whooping cough back then, about 15 years ago, something that had long ago gone away. And then this Harvard study, comes to light, basically telling us that COVID-19 almost hitches a ride, with PM 2.5. And the end result is that people who live near these facilities where we have exposure to air pollution, specifically PM 2.5, have a higher death rate because of it. And when in New Orleans, when they first showed the statistics for the city, and it showed that St. John Parish had the highest death rate for COVID, I was like, what in the world is going on? Why would this little town, have such high rates? And then the Harvard study came out, which absolutely told us why. They live in Cancer Alley, right across from polluting facilities with extreme exposure to PM 2.5 over long periods of time. So they fit the description that basically says you have a 15% higher mortality rate from COVID if you are exposed to PM 2.5. And so for me, we now have another reason to fight for a switch from fossil fuels, for example, to renewables, because it's killing us all. It's killing people who look like me faster, than it is other people, but it really is a dirty business that's hurting us. So the word to me is that this is not a separate fight. This is the same fight. And we can look forward to, as we look forward, or not happily, to more pandemics, we're being warned that this may be the new normal, where we will have other pandemics after this or the same one coming back. It means that we really need to pay more attention than what we have ever paid before to the connection between pollution and death. And now it also being related to pandemics.
So the PM 2.5 is particulate matter. Of a certain size.
Particulate matter, and I tell people particulate matter are really very tiny particles that come from facilities when they burn or whatever they do, materials that float into the air. And they're so tiny, we breathe them in. And the smaller they are, to some extent, the more dangerous they are, because they can go deeper and deeper into our lungs. So you take a virus like COVID-19, that's where it wants to go in your lungs, and it just hitches a ride with the PM 2.5, and it makes it a more virile disease for those people who are exposed to it.
On an ordinary day, getting the health support that they need in communities like Reserve, for example, is very difficult.
Yeah.
But now we have this sort of layered on top problem of getting testing, actually confirming the COVID-19 diagnosis. Am I right in assuming that this is just exacerbating already an overdue stress on the health system there? Tell us a little bit about how people seek healthcare in those spaces, in those EJ communities, environmental justice
Yeah,
communities?
well, for the most part, these communities would be considered rural. Many of them come to New Orleans. The most that they have are little small clinics. Those clinics don't offer much serious health care. To me, it's like going to an urgent care clinic where, you know, you go for a headache, but for anything really serious, it's difficult to get any assistance. It reminds me so much of Katrina because, you know, the same thing happened. The people who are least able to fight a flood or some disaster get it piled on to them at a time when they are less able to overcome the conditions that they live with every day. So it's like a piling on effect, you know. It's like, how do we get out of this? I have some ideas, and I think a lot of people may disagree with me, but I really believe that reparations is the only way, that we will never, ever be able to dig our way out of this mess that we're in, where every disaster, every pandemic just piles on top of us, and things get worse unless we do something about poverty and something to redress the harm that has been done to us and has really disabled us to be able to overcome economically, educationally, or whatever. The systematic or structural racism it has, the roots are so deep, and I don't know how you overcome that without something, you know, really dramatic, you know, to deal with it. And so I'm 72 years old and I'm talking about reparations, and people are looking at me like, you know, old lady, you know about reparations? Yeah, because we've been yelling for reparations for 30 years. So for us, it's not new. It may be new to young people, but this is the old rebel still yelling for reparations. And I often tell my students, you have to remember that we are the only people who are legally enslaved by this government. Other people came on boats, others came across borders. We were brought here and legally enslaved. That's a whole different situation from most other ethnic groups in this country, except maybe the Native Americans, and they have their own story, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
I don't see how we get out of this without something really drastic happening to redress the harm that's been done to African Americans.
Karen, it seems like the lens is on fire. I mean, with the stories, I was just looking right before we got on the call, some of these stories, and I mean, the tie-in to the kinds of issues that Beverly is talking about, the sort of structural racism problems, structural inequality problems. I mean, you have stories up right now about COVID-19 and incarcerated populations, ICE, the census. I just want to sort of get a sense from you what it's like, first of all, to edit a news organization from your home, but also what kind of stories are getting the greatest traction? What stories are you telling that the national media is not picking up? Take us inside the newsroom. It looks a little quiet in your newsroom, but I know that that's not really the reality of it. I bet you have 50 browser tabs open right now.
I do.
Excuse me.
We are fortunate in that in January of this year, we're a small newsroom. There are 6 of us at this point, 6, maybe even more. I have to count again because in January we decided we were going to forego an office and put all our funding into content for the most part. And so we all had been adapting to working remotely, and therefore, you know, communicating through Slack. If it weren't for Slack, you know, if we had had to figure out our communication strategy at the same time that we were beginning to report on this, it would have been much more difficult. We have reported. We were fortunate. We had Nick Trassell's been doing our criminal justice reporting. He was part-time. We immediately brought him on full-time to cover the prisons, and he's the first to write about Oakdale and the issues there. He has developed some good relationships with folks. I sort of run the kind of tip line, so to speak. So every day I do receive emails from families of the incarcerated, sometimes from folks who are incarcerated, as well as families of homeless folks who are looking for their people, and parents of children who, oftentimes people read an article in the Lens and then think that we're the conduit to solve their problem. And in that we do try and do that as well. So we're sort of running a bit of a society aid function as well as a news organization. We're community funded, we're grant funded. There's opportunities that have arisen and they came fast. And so we're constantly have one other person in the business side, which is Ann Mueller, and she and I are constantly looking at opportunities so that we can increase capacity in terms of the news. We also added a healthcare reporter, which is something I've wanted for a really long time, sort of to address the issues that Beverly's talking about, because when people say environmental here, they often think it means climate change, but environmental basically is everything. It impacts all of our social landscape, so to speak. So we were fortunate we had a healthcare reporter who jumped in and said, we need to be talking about more than just this COVID issue as it relates to all our other issues we cover. So in terms of a newsroom, we are basically a Slack newsroom. And fortunately, I have our editor, Charles Maldonado, who is, I jokingly call him the Oracle. Charles knows a lot, and if he doesn't know it, he figures it out real quick. And so he's managing all the reporters and has a lot of facts, figures, and moving targets at all times.
There's a continual issue with this. I guess any disaster, it seems particularly acute with this one. People seeking information and trying to get factual information and trying to balance something we've seen with this disaster, public pronouncements which are contradictory. I know in your state, your senators may be saying one thing, your governor another thing, your mayor another thing. Does that put a lot of pressure on a news organization to somehow both just report what's out there, but also to really give people who are reading your stories more than that, like analysis? How do you manage all of this flow of contradictory information from public officials?
Well, I feel like our governor has done a decent job of straight talking, as some who are not in our region believe that all the governors are Republicans and ours is not. Although I feel like he's much a statesman in terms of making sure he doesn't incite the president's temper. And so I don't feel like we've had to deal with a tremendous amount of institutional misinformation. I think our state senators are a little bit either absent from the daily dialogue here. Therefore, when they do sort of make their TV appearances and say things that are less than helpful, I don't think they're getting as big an audience as in the state as they may get in the national. What they're seeking is national attention, not statewide attention. And I will note that Billy Nungesser, our lieutenant governor, did apologize for criticisms he had levied against the mayor. A rare thing in politics is to see an apology.
I can't remember the last time I saw something like that. Yeah. Andy, let me ask you, you've got this book coming out about Katrina. So I know that thinking about COVID-19 in the context of Katrina has been on your mind. And I also know from knowing your work that you're careful to show that any disaster is not an event in itself, but it's somehow a summation of processes and decisions made long ago. I can't help but think that COVID-19 is a pretty good reflection of that. Can you take us a little into your thinking about the connection between COVID-19 and Katrina and how you're thinking about those two?
Yeah, and I should probably say first that so much of what I know about Louisiana or the world, I've learned from the three of you on this call. So I know more about what's going on in the city around me from the lens than from looking through my own eyes. And so I'm inspired by something that Professor Wright was just saying, that this sort of COVID arrives, the virus arrives on top a totally unequal landscape. And certainly, I guess I'd start here. You know, we call this a disaster. We imagine it as some kind of emergency, which then suggests that the people encountering it had some stable, normal status quo before that this interrupted. But for the people that we've spent our opening minutes talking about, people who are imprisoned, people who are suffering from toxic emissions all the time and in extraordinarily inhumane rates of cancer, for people who can't access healthcare on a regular day, this doesn't arrive to interrupt some normal, course of life. This is just yet another assault in what is a seemingly relentless series of assaults. So when I think about COVID as an analog with Katrina, one thing is to say is that COVID arrives from people still reeling from an extended process that we've named Katrina. People are still broke from that. People are still not stably housed. Our healthcare system is still a mess. All the things that, all the broken things that we associate with Katrina, many of them are still broken. So it's not that this is like that, it's that this is coming into Katrina's world, I think, is a way of thinking about it. Another thing, but on the analog, one thing I think that might be productive for us to think about is how even the question of the name. We named this disaster Katrina, and that tricks a lot of people, not New Orleanians, but it tricks a lot of people from thinking that somehow the hurricane caused the problems that we now name Katrina. But in fact, many, the hurricane didn't do much damage in New Orleans. It was a failed federal infrastructure. And it's the failed federal infrastructure that we're seeing is hurting so many people now. Naming this thing COVID-19 or coronavirus as if the germs are somehow getting to us, when what we see is a completely inept response and a completely unfair American landscape for trying to address it. Who has to go to work, who can stay home, who can see a doctor, who can't. All of those questions are not caused by the virus. These are not damages. This is not damage that's in your lungs. It's damage done to you by your neighbors and fellow citizens. So I think we should think carefully about thinking about this as an acute emergency that comes out of nowhere as the virus is going to infect people and cause damage, when in fact what we have is a whole history of inequality, structural inequality, into which comes a new variable that simply animates all of the old problems of long standing.
Beverly, just let me, yeah, I want to get both Karen and Beverly on this.
Okay.
Karen, go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it's no surprise to us that there's a dysfunctional federal government, and in terms of how they respond to disasters. But I'm always hesitant to say that, taking it one step further, which is we don't need them. We do need them. I mean, I can pick up trash on my street. I can't, build a landfill, so to speak. I can't build a levee. I can't make tests for COVID in my kitchen. We do need a federal response, but the shock that it's inadequate is I would suggest is not a shock to New Orleanians, who waited and waited and waited, and then went on their way and fixed what they could. So the resonance between those two events is I think deep here. The way in which it affects us is deep.
Beverly, same question to you. I mean, Andy's talking about this problem of maybe the speed at which people think about disaster. And what you were saying earlier, the real issues we've got to be talking about they're hard issues. Americans don't like to talk about them much, frankly. Poverty, structural inequality. I mean, I'm sure people must be asking you, what do you think about Katrina in this context? Is it even useful comparison? Does it take us away from talking about the more central questions? How do you think about that?
Oh, well, I don't think that COVID takes us away at all from talking about racial inequality and, economic inequality, health disparities. I don't. They are absolutely connected. The problem is that we don't seem to be able to deal with a multitude of things at one time. Take something to me that's seems complicated, but it's necessary right now. If you have any disease, anything that needs immediate attention at a hospital, you're kind of in trouble. It's very difficult. If you're going to have a heart attack, this is not a good time to have it. You know, because we don't seem to be able to deal with COVID and just regular everyday life for people. So you take that regular everyday life for people with money, where we find an inverse relationship between being able to stay at home and income. So if you have a lot of money, the richer you are, the more likely you are able to work from home. The poorer you are, the less likely you are to be able to work from home. So that means you're out delivering groceries, all of the grunt work that puts you at higher risk. Well, the same thing is true, you know, now we see with hospital situations. If you don't have any money, you're in trouble for certain. If you don't have hospitalization, you're in trouble. And you have to be a really, really special person with some kind of connections if you have a heart attack to be able to get the kind of help you need immediately. Example, I have friends who are doctors. So if something goes wrong, even now, I call that friend. I'm like, what do you think this is? Oh, let's call, oh, you need to do this. We still have access that people without money don't have. And I say this always, until we really start working really hard to do for the least of us, the rest of us will not be safe. And that was proven with Katrina, when you found out that the Uptown folks had representatives worked harder to protect them from the levee. So they had a levee built that they thought protected them, but it didn't, because there was too much pressure on the one part that was built. When the water came, it took that away too. So we're still looking at, we're so divided. And I think that this president will go down in history, to me, as being the most divisive president we have had. And maybe he hasn't been the most divisive in terms of policy, although I think that may be the case. I'd like to look at that. But certainly in verbally, you know, representing divisive kinds of public policy or opinions, he's at the top of it. And we find ourselves not being able to move forward on anything because of the divisiveness. And so the book that Bob and I wrote, this speaks to that, the government's response. The government's response, while it has always been inadequate, it has been less adequate for people of color, in particular, African Americans. So we're always the last to get to the help. We looked at the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor, where white people who had some political power were able to get the chemical companies to buy their homes and move further away from the companies, while Black people were left there to languish. The result being 80% of African Americans living near polluting facilities or TRI facilities, as opposed to whites. So, you know, you try to figure that race just seems to factor into everything that goes on as it relates to quality of life for African Americans in the Deep South. And of course, as you go out, the people of color, where their numbers go up, you see the same kind of thing happening. So I tell people it's a problem with the soul of white people. You know, somehow those discussions need to be had. And I always tell people when they want to talk about race, I'm like, I don't need to be in this room. I'm not the one with the race problem. You know, when I move in, if I move into a neighborhood and they're white people, I don't run because they're white. But as soon as we move in, they move out. We don't have the race problem. We believe in integration and all of these things. White people have the race problem. They are the people who need to be talking. And I say, stop bringing me in so you can feel better, you know, by having the one person in the room. The talk you need to have with your grandparents ought to be between you and your grandparents. not me. I don't need to be in the room. And those are the hard kinds of discussions that we have not had. We've not been able to have them. And so here we are. It's like we're all going to go down together. In the end, we'll all go down together. That's what people don't understand. The one thing that I will say is this, and because I tend to talk too long, but what has been just really exciting for me is to see the pollution levels go down the way that they have because we aren't moving around. And I would always tell my students, the earth does not need us. The earth doesn't need us for anything, but we need the earth. And if we continue to kill it, it will end up in a place where it cannot sustain us. We'll be gone, but the earth will still be here. And I think that we're seeing signs of that now. We're all being pushed inside. You know, what's happening could kill us all. It could absolutely kill us all at some point, but the earth will still be here. And when we're gone, guess what? The sky is clear, the stars are showing, the birds are chirping. They're not getting these diseases, just us. This could be a lesson for us in how we should move forward in dealing with the environment.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we are talking to Beverly Wright and Karen Gadbois and Andy Horowitz. Andy, this terrain that Beverly has just been sketching out really, I think, is also lands on the desk of historians to think about the interconnections between race, the making of Louisiana, the making of New Orleans, and disaster. Things that too often I think we have separated out and treated separately historiographically, maybe. I don't know. I mean, can you help us think with that a little bit, how you approach telling these as interconnected stories, how the making of New Orleans is also about the making of disaster and the making of racial division? That's a huge question to throw at you, but I want to know how you think about it.
How do we, yeah, I think I understand your questions. How do we tell a true story about the history of the world?
There you go.
So let me tell you in 45 seconds.
You should be on this side of the desk. Yeah, that's
I
good.
figured it out. But I think I can maybe move the conversation forward by saying that it's often people's instinct, scholars and everyone, to try to tease out these different strands, to put health disparities over here, or, health over here, race over here, economics over here. Can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting about anything and I've said something about how I see the world as a historian, and someone complains that suddenly I'm political, as if politics is supposed to be in its own hermetically sealed box from anything else. And of course, that's a lie about how the world works, and it doesn't aid anybody. And what you have to do instead, the goal is always to see how these things fit together, both in the present and in the past. And I think one of the things that is very challenging to do and unsettling for people is to explain how, or to try to reckon with how sometimes the problems that we face are in fact products of our successes. I thought about this a lot trying to figure out Katrina's history, because in point of fact, one of the reasons that African Americans were, the African Americans who were exposed to floodwaters when the levees broke, were people who had in fact been able to move to the post-World War II sprawled city. These were people who didn't live in the most impoverished neighborhoods in the state, but rather people who had realized that sort of American dream and lived in a single family house, a ranch house on slab. These were people who had to some degree succeeded. And yet, so it's not that it's some straight line to disaster. Things can get better and get worse at the same time. So I've mentioned that now to say that, it's coronavirus, the COVID that we face, is not just a product of a series, a litany of mistakes. We're seeing here a brief of our connected world, how much we need each other. We want to be people who desperately want to be interacting all the time and be in large groups. And this is one of, New Orleans, so I guess where I'm trying to land here is at Mardi Gras, and the terrible assertions that somehow New Orleans had done something illegitimate and foolish by gathering together for Mardi Gras. But our, social celebrations are one of our great achievements and one of the city's great contributions to the world. And so though that probably is responsible, we know that is, along with the inequalities, racial and economic inequalities that define the city, our sociability is one of the things that made this city uniquely vulnerable. And we have to reckon with the fact that sometimes the things that work really well for us then put us at special risk too. So how do we tell those stories? I think we just try to be honest with them. And similarly, we have to be honest to say, thinking about what Karen was saying before, that we know that the federal government is inadequate. It's very inadequate at doing certain things. It's inadequate at producing the tests that we desperately need, but it works with ruthless and devastating efficiency when it comes to propping up the social order. We saw our elected officials nearly, blowing gaskets when they thought that somehow someone illegitimately might get too much money in their benefit check. That somehow they might be made somewhat less than miserable and impoverished, would totally upset the social order, and the thing had to be shut down immediately. And the rich got richer. So in some things that we do, the federal government is ruthlessly effective. It's only in certain key aspects of its activities that it fails, and probably it fails by design. And we should be honest about that too. That sort of takes us all over the place. That's not the answer to the question, but it's the answer to some other questions.
But I think bringing those all into one frame is what we're trying to do, and to not somehow separate them out as separate stories. And I mean, Karen,
it's an interesting time when we're living in reality and metaphor at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, Karen, can you say a little bit more about the challenge of that? Andy's talking about telling a history that may stretch over decades, but I mean, you have the challenge to actually sort of capture much more near-term stories that also illustrate these kinds of phenomena that are happening. So when you're trying to reach your audience and have maybe an individual person's story somehow stand in for these larger conflicts and battles of long-standing, I don't know how you do that. Like, how do you even begin to think along those lines of having these individual moments in time or days tell the broader story?
Well, I mean, I will credit Charles Maldonado, who's our editor, with being the one who's really midwifing all those stories, because I know there are a couple of reporters right now who today in our morning meeting were just becoming overwhelmed with the amount of stories that are there to be told. Right. Not just individual stories, but institutional stories that affect individuals. And so, I know that Charles tries very hard, and I think he's very successful at making sure that, one, those stories are told from a perspective of straight journalism. Like these are not meant to be in any way sort of influencing policy, but informing, but illuminating policy. For instance, the story we did about the N95 masks at the convention center and the cost, immediately after publishing, within hours of publishing that, where they were selling, one vendor was selling them for $14. They're usually, 35 cents or something. The state did send out a press release to say, oh, we're going to be looking into that. So that's an important story, because the Lens was founded as a post-Katrina corruption watchdog publication. And I was just a person who had been affected in a flooded home in New Orleans and looked around and thought, what will this city look like in a decade? And started writing about demolitions, specifically because the houses represented people. And found something that our local newspaper had not had the capacity to report on. And so I feel that same way now, where our goal is to report things that are not being reported elsewhere, and to spend the very long time that it takes to report some of those issues. And so that's number one. If it's being reported, we're not chasing. If it's a press conference, probably not chasing. We'll do a live blog, we'll do a live tweet, but we won't chase. And so therefore we're, everyone that works for us has the luxury, which it is a luxury in journalism now, to spend time a lot of time on the work they do. So that's a primary goal of what we do.
Be that as it may, I am worried. I mean, particularly for journalists and I mean, healthcare professionals for sure. Anybody who's in the fight in the hospitals. I mean, what they're going through right now is unimaginable, I think, to most people. But also, people in the activist community. You know, the people that you're working with, Beverly, and that you're helping to organize, the scientists who support them and work with them, and the journalists whose job is to try to make sense of all of this on a daily basis. I'm really worried. I mean, this is not a disaster. This is a process, and this is going to unfold. I mean, we're in a 2-year at least process here that are going to have multiple phases of sheltering and unsheltering. How do you think about sustaining your work in the midst of this? I mean, it's on a blue sky day, it's, well, hard enough, but how are you going to sustain the funding streams, the work, the morale? I mean, I really worry about stress and trauma for people who are in these kind of very difficult jobs. Beverly, can you react to that first?
Well, I will react to that, but there was just something that I was thinking about that I really want to say.
Please
And
do.
is after Katrina, the concern was whether or not New Orleans could survive. And we knew that it would survive, but it would be different. I don't think any of us ever dreamed that it would be quite this different. In that New Orleans has survived with gentrification at warp speed, with the displacement of poor African Americans being pushed out all the way to slide down because they can't afford the housing, the price of rent and all of that. So New Orleans is changing. For those of us who grew up in this city the way that I did and can trace my heritage back 8 generations to free coloreds on one hand and slaves on the other, having that kind of history and seeing us pushed out to the extent that we've been pushed out is devastating. I see the same thing happening with COVID-19. I mean, our old people are dying at rates that are just unbelievable. I alone have at least 20 people that I know who have the virus, and at least 10 who have died, including neighbors on my street, all elderly. And so I always say, it's just, for me, it seems so unfair. And I tell people, I say, do you know how hard it is to be African American and live to be 85 or 82? And you try to do everything right, and then a damn virus takes you out, you know, with all the struggle you had to live that long. And I'm really angry about it. And then to discover that, you know, all of the racist kinds of things that put you where you are in terms of where you live with COVID-19 and all the other, you know, disparities that exist had a lot to do with this. So you were able to deal with the health disparities, but you couldn't beat COVID-19. That is really distressing. But in terms of the people who you mentioned being able to survive, you know, that whole group, if you look at what the income stream is for many of them, this is what happens. Those of us who have good funding from foundations or who have been able to raise money will probably raise more money now because of COVID-19. The smaller groups who don't have much funding, some of them will get funding because of this, and others will go by the wayside. I think that because of the work that I would do if I didn't have a dime. And that's the way it is for a lot of activists, scholars, and plain organizers and activists. They wouldn't stop because of this. In terms of mental health, that's always been an issue for activists and organizers, mental health and health, period. We've lost an unbelievable number of organizers, you know, who did grassroots organizing, who didn't have health insurance at all, and who have passed away. So on that front, I don't see a lot changing. For us, I just got off of an NIHS um, webcast, and at the end of the webcast, they had a what do you call it? A relaxing exercise for us. So it's something that's really recognized in the work we do, especially with foundations. They're always telling us, we need to find a way to deal with mental health. So we're not the ones that that anybody should be worried about. It is the people who have family members that are sick and dying at an unbelievable rate. They live in houses where there are two people to a room, maybe two in a bed. So, how do you separate at that rate? Those are the people that I'm concerned about. I'm not at all concerned about us. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Karen, can I ask you about that? I mean, you have a lot of experience, covering Katrina and, now this story. How do you maintain the morale of the newsroom? How do you maintain the health of the newsroom in a situation like this?
Well, I have a mandatory Monday morning mental health and physical health check-in, which I do. I have been sort of mother henning by making cookies and driving to everyone's house once a week so I can look at their faces to make sure people are feeling, stable. I try and contact their family members for some of our staff who are alone and young, to make sure that their family feels like they can talk to me, and remind them and myself. As a friend of mine once said to me, after Katrina is a closed loop, and this is a closed loop. This will not. I'm 65. I fully imagine that this will be talked about until I die.
Mhm.
This is a cataclysmic event that will subsume you. It will consume you if you allow it to consume you. And at this point, we're in the stage where, yes, it is consumptive, but it's also important to figure out what that thing is. Beverly was saying earlier, she likes to look out the window at nature. We all have to figure out what is that thing that sustains us. So that's I used to jokingly call life as a tour of duty, and that other things I did is the tour of beauty, and I would try and look at something that was beautiful, create something that was beautiful, be someplace that was beautiful. During the course of the day. I think that that was Instagram for me. A place of beauty. So that's those more. Some folks find that in church, some folks find that in nature, some folks find that in literature or wherever. But that's this period will pass, but the aftermath will be God knows how long. Between when you have this amount of money that is passing hands right now, there's corruption, there's mismanagement, there's all kinds of stuff that for journalists, and then again, people are getting these $1,200 checks. I wouldn't imagine that a year from now they're not going to be paying some dues on that money, if you understand what I'm saying.
Added to your taxes.
There's the unintended consequence. Yeah, whatever it may be,
My faculty members in my department are probably hearing you say that you deliver cookies to your staff house, that they're gonna be wondering where I am on Monday morning. I'm gonna have to edit that part out,
Yeah.
Karen, I'm sorry. Andy, there's been, in both things that Beverly and Karen have been talking about, the impact of this disaster reaching very far into the future. And with that in mind, I want to ask you a question about time, I guess, and disaster. New Orleans is a city, well, let's go back before Katrina. I mean, New Orleans is a city with a deeper history of public health crises,
Mm.
right? I mean, this is historically, I mean, for African Americans, certainly, and going back into slavery and throughout that period. But I think there are pandemics that have swept through New Orleans throughout its history that have left a mark on the city. Maybe harder to find. I don't know. Could you tell us a little bit of that history, put it in a deeper context?
Yeah, we could have started by remembering that before New Orleans acquired these lovely the Crescent City, or the city the care forgot, New Orleans was the necropolis of the South. And it was called that because of how many people would die in the 19th century and into the 20th century of yellow fever. Thousands in a summer, often. Meaningful double-digit percentages of the population would die every summer, or often enough that it was an expected feature of life here. And in fact, the drainage system that fails us so poorly now, every time it rains, these bigger rains we've been having, is a product of a progressive era impulse to try to drain the swamps that bred the mosquitoes that were causing those diseases. So there's a way in which you can tell the story of Katrina as a sort of failure of the long tail of that progressive era drive for city building. That, I wouldn't exactly want to call it that, but certainly the failure to maintain its ambitions is how I would describe it. And in thinking about the progressive era, one thing that happened then, and happened out of those public health campaigns at the turn of the 20th century, was the sense there were posters that were popular in parts of the South that advocated the fly knows no color line. And the idea there was that there was no way to sort of uphold strict Jim Crow inequalities in the face of a public health crisis like yellow fever and malaria, because the mosquito, in the logic of this poster, would travel from the unclean or underserved Black neighborhoods into the wealthier white neighborhoods. So the idea was that, and this was promulgated in part by African American women, progressive women, who said, you have to provide public health infrastructure over here if you want to have it for yourself. And that was something that New Orleanians learned maybe after Katrina, that there was no way to build a levee system that was only going to protect just the wealthy white neighborhoods, because when the water came into the bowl, it was going to flood everybody. This is true of government in general. This is true of the American state in general. And we're constantly rediscovering how the sort of white supremacist antipathy for strong government services undermines security even for the wealthy white supremacists themselves. So if we had a strong federal government right now, a strong federal response, wealthy white people would be better off too. It wouldn't just be serving, I'm thinking about what Karen was saying about the illegitimacy of who's going to get these $1,200 checks. Well, you need everybody to be able to stay home in order to protect yourself and your kids. It doesn't, you desperately want to, doesn't matter how much you dislike your neighbor, the public health interest is in making sure that they have what they need to be able to stay home. It's in your best interest. But there's been a sort of white supremacist conservative rhetoric that's been rehearsed for generations now, trying to teach people not to think that way and instead to think of themselves as in constant competition with their neighbors, that undermines the whole system. So you get the underfunded levees that fail and collapse everything. You get the underfunded health system that fails and everybody gets hurt. And so I think that when we tell the story of coronavirus, thinking about where to start and where to stop it, and returning to something I said before, we would be very unwise and delusional even to start with the story of a virus that came in from a wet market in China, which is where Donald Trump would like us to start. And we might be better off starting it with intense commitment to not having healthcare for everybody. That might be the more accurate place to start in order to explain the disparities that exist. That might be where I would start the story, or in the intense commitment to something called the economy, which we all should just be honest is a complete make-believe fiction. I defy anyone to go out and encounter the economy on the street, go shake the economy's hand, go slap the economy across the face. It's not real. But we, have set this thing up like we have public health on one hand and economy on the other, but public health's the thing that'll kill you. The economy, we make the money. We've decided that that's going to be the thing that we foreground. And that's because we have an intense ideological commitment to a certain kind of fiction. And we could start the story of coronavirus there too, with the desire not to simply spend the money that it will take to let people stay home, to let the virus go away. this is actually a rather easy problem to solve, but we refuse to do the things that would make it easy to solve. So now if the idea is that we're going to beat the virus without spending any money and without providing universal health care, well, then we're back to trying to have strong levees for some people and weak ones for others, and the water's going to fill the bowl either way. And that's my take on this now.
Yeah, but thank you for putting that in that deeper context, because we do find out in a disaster what the deeper commitments of the society are. And two of the ones that we, as Beverly, I think, was telling us earlier, two of the ones we either think we've gotten past in some places, or that we don't want to be reminded of, are segregation and failure of the health system. And if this disaster is revealing those as ongoing processes in American life, that's the real disaster. But this commitment to the vector, the commitment to the mosquito, or to the hurricane swirling in the Gulf, or to the wet market, that still rhetorically has so much power out there.
And you can see it, I would just add that you can see it pretty clearly in the rhetoric of people who say, we need to provide grants to businesses, or that coronavirus treatment should be free because people got it through no fault of their own. That's a phrase that we've been hearing from a lot of people, certainly Louisiana senators, no fault of their own, as if people get cancer through fault of their own. Right. We have the sense that we're going to try to isolate this so that we can keep the rest of the system intact. Your lupus, you brought that on yourself, so you're going to have to cover that. But somehow this is different. This is illegitimate because suddenly a certain segment of white middle and upper class people who come to think that American citizenship represents a promise to protect them from this kind of upset, they feel like they've been illegitimately harmed and they want to be returned to where they are before without upsetting their status in the broader social order. So they don't want anyone else to get theirs either.
And out the stigma, right. So we're almost up on time. I want to get just a quick final question to each of you that maybe each of you can briefly address if you care to, and it actually comes to this issue around memory. I have been surprised and disappointed. I'm very interested in disaster memorials, the way we remember these moments in time. And, the failure to have a meaningful Katrina memorial, to me, now I'm an outsider, so I know there are many other kinds of things that maybe much more informal, don't look like a big 9/11 memorial there in New Orleans, but memory and memorialization is important. It's important as a process to continue to provoke, I think, discussion of politics and not to just cover things over and say it's over. So I guess my question is really about, how do you think COVID-19 will be remembered in New Orleans? And how should it be? How should it be remembered, do you think? Beverly, can I ask you that question first? I think we lost the audio there.
Sorry, that was my fault.
No, that's okay.
I really, for me, just going to personalize this now, and I shouldn't, but I just feel that I want to. COVID-19 for me is the frosting on the cake for Donald Trump's failure to this country, and especially to poor people and people of color. His complete lack of empathy or ability to deal with something as big as this, I think it falls squarely on him. And I really believe that the COVID-19 will be remembered for the changes in our lifestyle that are being forced upon us because of it. I also believe that if we do this right, the lessons that we can learn from it in terms of the environment and environmental health, certainly in my community, will be memorable. All of the unbelievable changes that we saw, like fish in the water in Venice and seeing stars in China for the first time, for the people that I work with, if not, this is proof that our push to a reduction in emissions can not only save the life of the planet, but can improve the health of most of the people on this earth. So for me, it's a bad thing that really in the end may turn out to be for our good. And I think that it's also showing us, as one foreign leader said, I think it was Norwegian, that you taught us what to do when there's a pandemic, but you're not following it. And hopefully those words mean, since this is coming again, we can learn from the mistakes that were made, or the fact that running a government is more than making a dollar. And I think that's where, where we are right now. The fight is between the greedy and the needy, as the kids would say, because a lot of what we're doing is just all about money. And it shouldn't be.
Karen, what do you think? The memory of COVID-19, how is that going to stick in New Orleans?
Well, I was, before, in the early days when deaths were being first reported, and you had a sneaky suspicion that the numbers for African Americans were higher than for others. And then because early days, they really weren't announcing details. And then the governor announced there would be a task force, and I just thought to myself, please God, no more task force. I mean, if it's a big mystery to you why this is happening, then shame on you for it being such a big mystery. And as Beverly had mentioned earlier about reparations, perhaps the reparations could come in the form of access to livable wage, to healthcare. That those, I have a weekend place in Mississippi. It's a big old schoolhouse that had been abandoned in a town that's crumbling like most towns in Mississippi and most rural places in the South. And, when I got in that place, I thought to myself, this is the legacy of racism, where towns self-annihilated rather than create opportunities for everybody. And so this idea of the city of New Orleans needs to be a place that creates opportunity for everyone. And that's the monument I'd like to see from this event. We had it with Katrina, and now we're having it again. And if you need a task force to figure out why we have so many folks dying, then you're not paying attention, and you shouldn't be in a position of power.
So Andy, we have a clear sky memorial of a moment in time when we actually can see the stars at night. That's also true here in New Jersey. It's kind of amazing. We have a no more task forces monument in front of Karen's house. What are you going to build?
I mean, to my mind, the only monument worth building to COVID is universal health care. I mean, if we somehow get through this as a society without understanding that that's the central thing that is one of the central things that went wrong here, then we have just so deluded ourselves that we shouldn't call it over. I think that's where I am. Universal healthcare.
Andy Horowitz, Karen Gadbois, and Beverly Wright, thank you so much for spending this hour on COVID calls. What an amazing conversation. And I have a feeling we may, by the end of the summer, need to come back to you for some updates on all the work that you've been doing. Thank you for all you're doing.
Thanks, Scott.
Hopefully we'll be here late in the summer, Scott. That's the real prayer we all need to make.
Everybody, please come back to check out COVID Calls Monday at 5 o'clock when we talk about government and maybe the chance that COVID-19 will reform or cause reforms in our government. Possible. And what those might look like, with Tom Birkland, Rob DeLeo, and Kristen Taylor. Everybody stay healthy, and thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.